There's a storm brewing inside the walls of the Vatican, and it's not one the Church can ignore. One of the most prominent conservative voices in Catholicism, Cardinal Raymond Burke, has sent a warning not just to the faithful, but directly to Pope Leo XIV himself. The Church is being pulled away from the truth. Now, that's not just a casual critique. That's a spiritual alarm bell. And for anyone who's been following the inner workings of the Church, this moment feels like something far bigger than just theological disagreement. This feels like the beginning of something deeper, something potentially seismic. A theological rebellion, some might say. So, what's really going on? What pushed Cardinal Burke to go public with such a sharp and ominous warning? And more importantly, is this a sign that the Church is about to fracture in ways we haven't seen in generations? Let's unpack this. For starters, Cardinal Raymond Leo Burke isn't new to controversy. He's been one of the most outspoken critics of liberal shifts in Catholic leadership over the past decade. From openly opposing Pope Francis' more progressive stances to warning against what he sees as dangerous ambiguities in church teaching, Burke has never been one to mince words. But his recent statement, aimed squarely at Pope Leo XIV, is different. It's sharper, it's more urgent, and it seems to suggest that we're at a tipping point. Burke's warning centers around what he calls a departure from divine truth. That phrase alone should send chills down the spine of anyone who understands the theological gravity of such an accusation. For a cardinal to suggest that the Church itself, under its current pope, is veering off from divine truth? That's not theological banter. That's a battle cry. And he's not alone. Behind Burke's words is a growing undercurrent of dissatisfaction among conservative Catholics. To many of them, Pope Leo XIV represents a continuation of what they view as a dangerous liberalization of church doctrine, a trend that began under Pope Francis and seems to be accelerating under Leo's leadership. Let's talk about Pope Leo XIV for a moment. Leo came into office with a reputation for being a bridge builder. He was expected to calm the waters after a decade of internal conflict. Many hoped he'd bring unity. But instead, what we've seen is more division, more controversy, and now open warnings from senior cardinals. Why? Well, according to critics like Burke, it's because Pope Leo XIV is pushing reforms that blur the lines of traditional Catholic teaching. Doctrines that were once seen as black and white are now being repackaged in shades of gray. And that gray area is exactly what Burke is calling out. He's especially concerned about the way the Church is handling issues like moral relativism, sacramental discipline, and the role of personal conscience in interpreting doctrine. These are not just abstract theological debate. These are the foundations of Catholic belief, and to change them, or even to soften them, is, in Burke's view, to betray the very identity of the Church. But it's not just about theology. It's about authority. Burke has long maintained that no pope, no matter how popular or charismatic, has the authority to change what the Church has always taught to be true. He sees Pope Leo XIV not just as a reformer, but as someone potentially overstepping the bounds of papal authority. And he's not keeping that opinion to himself. In his latest statement, Burke said, "We must not allow the Church to become confused by false shepherds, even if they wear white. That's a loaded sentence. Let's be clear. When a cardinal refers to a false shepherd wearing white, he's not being subtle. He's talking about the Pope. That is a level of public criticism we rarely, if ever, see in the Catholic hierarchy. And it shows just how deeply the theological fault lines are opening up beneath the surface. But is this just about one man's opinion? Or is Burke speaking for a larger group? There's increasing evidence that he is. In recent months, several other cardinals and bishops, many of whom remained quiet during Pope Francis' tenure, have begun voicing similar concerns. They're worried that under the guise of compassion and inclusivity, the Church is diluting eternal truths. That instead of guiding souls with clarity, the Church is now tiptoeing around cultural pressures. This fear has only intensified with recent synods and Vatican discussions that appear to open the door to changes on previously settled matters, like blessings for same-sex couples, intercommunion with Protestants, and how the Church handles divorce and remarriage. To traditionalists like Burke, these aren't just pastoral discussions, they're cracks in the foundation. And the fear is that if those cracks widen, the whole structure could eventually give way. This is why Burke's warning feels different this time. It's not just criticism, it's prophecy. He's not just saying the Church is making mistakes. He's saying the Church is being pulled, dragged even, away from the truth. That implies external forces, internal betrayal, and possibly even spiritual deception. Now, for the average Catholic sitting in a pew on Sunday, this might all sound a bit abstract. But to those paying attention, this isn't theoretical, it's existential. Because if Burke is right, and the Church is truly being pulled away from the truth, then we're not just talking about doctrinal disagreements. We're talking about a spiritual war. And this war isn't happening outside the Church. It's happening inside. Here's the chilling part. This isn't the first time in history that powerful church leaders have clashed over doctrine. We've seen councils, schisms, even antipope. But the question today is, will this growing rebellion remain behind the scenes, or will it erupt into full view? Will we see cardinals refusing to recognize papal authority? Will there be calls for a formal correction? Or even worse, a split? These are no longer fringe theories. These are real possibilities being whispered among clergy and laity alike. And if you've been watching the tone of recent church debates, the whispers are getting louder. In fact, there's talk among insiders that Burke and others may soon issue a new dubia, a formal set of questions demanding clarity from Pope Leo XIV. The last time that happened, under Pope Francis, it caused waves throughout the Catholic world. And some believe we're heading for another storm. But let's pause here for a moment. Because at the heart of all this noise, controversy, and confusion, there's a deeper question. What is truth? That's the question Burke is ultimately forcing the Church to confront. And that's the question Pope Leo XIV must answer, not with ambiguity, not with press statements, but with courage and clarity. Because if the Church loses its grip on truth, what else is left? So now we stand in a moment of tension. On one side, Cardinal Raymond Burke and others are raising red flags, insisting that the Church is veering off the path laid down by centuries of sacred tradition. On the other side, Pope Leo XIV seems determined to continue his vision for a more pastorally relevant church, one that adapts to the world without, as he puts it, losing its soul. But here's the question: can the church adapt without compromising? Can it engage with the modern world without softening eternal truths? That's the razor-thin line being walked right now. And both sides, Burke's conservative camp and Leo's reformist wing, are claiming they're the ones defending the true identity of the church. But as this theological tug-of-war escalates, what's becoming clearer is that the middle ground is disappearing. People are choosing sides, and the silence is breaking. Let's zoom out a bit and ask, why is this happening now? Part of the answer lies in the moment we're living in. The church is facing immense pressure, both from within and from the outside. Secularism is rising. Traditional church attendance is falling. Scandals have shaken trust. And in the midst of all this, there's a sense that the church is losing its voice, especially among younger generations. For some leaders, especially Pope Leo XIV, the solution seems to be renewal through openness, reimagining the church's engagement with society, speaking more to people's experiences, leaning into compassion, and being less dogmatic in tone. But for Cardinal Burke, this is precisely where the danger lies. He doesn't see this as renewal. He sees it as surrender. And when you listen closely to his warnings, there's a deeper spiritual concern at play. Burke believes that what's being presented as modernization is actually a form of quiet apostasy, a drifting away from God's truth under the seductive guise of mercy. To him, the mission of the church isn't to blend in with the world. It's to stand apart from it, to offer something distinct, holy, eternal. And in his view, when the church starts to blur the lines, on sin, on marriage, on salvation, it stops being a beacon of truth and becomes just another voice in the noise. So when he says the church is being pulled away from the truth, what he's really saying is, we've forgotten who we are. Now let's talk about the reaction. Pope Leo XIV hasn't responded publicly to Burke's latest comments, but insiders say he's fully aware of them. And there are signs the Vatican is growing increasingly uncomfortable with the rising chorus of conservative critique. Some reports even suggest that pressure is mounting behind the scenes to silence or sideline outspoken figures like Burke. Whether that happens or not, it's clear that the climate inside the Vatican is tense. This brings us to the broader question: how does all of this affect the average Catholic? If you're sitting at home, trying to raise a family, praying your rosary, or just trying to live a good and faithful life, it might be tempting to tune all of this out. To shrug and say, let the cardinals debate theology. That's not my concern. But the truth is, it is your concern. Because what's being debated at the highest levels of the church will eventually trickle down to your parish, your children's catechism classes, your priest's homilies. If the church changes how it defines truth, it changes how you live it. And that's why this moment matters. Let's go back to a key phrase Burke used: false shepherds. That's language we don't often hear from church leaders, at least not directed inward. But it's scriptural, and it taps into a long-standing Christian fear that wolves can come in sheep's clothing, even inside the church. Burke isn't saying this lightly. He's invoking the image of spiritual deception, not just error, but betrayal. And this is where the conversation turns even more intense. There are whispers among some clergy and laity that what we're witnessing isn't just a political dispute, but a spiritual one. That there are forces inside and outside the Church, trying to reshape Catholicism into something unrecognizable. Something that looks like religion but no longer carries the power of truth. That may sound dramatic, but remember, the Church doesn't just exist in the political or philosophical realm. It exists in the spiritual realm. And if you believe that, then you also believe that deception can happen even under the guise of unity and peace. This brings us to the role of the faithful. In moments like this, when confusion spreads and leaders clash, the faithful are often caught in the middle. But this isn't a time to be passive. This is a time to be spiritually alert. Burke's message isn't just for the Pope. It's for you. It's a call to wake up, to dig deeper, to hold fast to what's been handed down, to guard your soul from the subtle creep of compromise. But let's be honest, this is hard, because no one wants to think that their leaders, especially spiritual ones, might be leading them astray. No one wants to believe that confusion could come from the very top. And yet, church history tells us this has happened before. There have been crises. There have been corrupt popes. There have been moments when saints stood against the current and called the church back to faithfulness. That's the pattern Burke is tapping into. And whether you agree with him or not, you have to acknowledge this. He believes he's fighting for the soul of the church. So what comes next? That's the question everyone is asking. And the truth is, no one knows for sure. Will Pope Leo respond with clarity? Will he confront these growing doubts and reaffirm the unchanging truths of the faith? Or will he continue down a path that many feel is already too blurred, too soft, too unstable? Will more bishops join Burke and speak out? Or will fear keep them silent? One thing is certain, this moment is not going away. In fact, the lines are hardening, the silence is breaking, and the faithful, especially the young and the devout, are watching closely, because they're hungry for clarity. They don't want a church that tries to blend in with every cultural shift. They want a church that stands firm, that speaks truth, even when it's unpopular, that offers something timeless in a world that changes by the hour. That's what this is all about. Not just doctrine, not just church politics, but identity. Who are we? What do we believe? And are we willing to defend it, even when it's uncomfortable? And now we find ourselves at a crossroads. The questions raised by Cardinal Burke are not going to quietly fade away. They're echoing in parishes, in seminaries, in living rooms where faithful Catholics are watching this moment with growing anxiety. And the Church, whether it wants to or not, must give an answer. Pope Leo XIV has often spoken about the need for dialogue, about the importance of walking with people, listening to them, and creating space for differing voices within the Church. And in theory, that sounds pastoral, compassionate, even wise. But here's the dilemma. When it comes to truth, how much room is there for ambiguity? That's what Burke is trying to get at. Because in the Catholic worldview, truth isn't something we vote on. It isn't a mood or a cultural trend. It's not even something we discover for ourselves. It's something revealed, through Christ, through Scripture, through the consistent teachings of the Church. And once you believe that, it becomes incredibly dangerous to start reimagining doctrines or reinventing the moral framework just to keep up with the times. That's why Burke and others are sounding the alarm, not because they want to tear down the Pope, but because they believe the Church is flirting with spiritual disaster. In a way, this crisis is uncovering something deeper that's been simmering beneath the surface for years. A kind of identity crisis. What does it mean to be Catholic in the 21st century? Is Catholicism just a spiritual lifestyle, a set of values we loosely follow, or is it a clear, demanding, life-altering path based on absolute truth? Is the Church here to comfort people in their journey, or to call them to radical conversion? Is unity more important than truth? Or is true unity only possible because of truth? Pope Leo XIV seems to be wrestling with these questions himself, or at least guiding the Church through a process of synodality that raises them again and again. And to some, that's hopeful. To others, including Burke, it's deeply troubling, because asking certain questions, if done carelessly, can unravel the very fabric of what the Church has always stood for. Let's not forget, there's a fine line between reform and rupture, and historically, when that line has been crossed, the results haven't been renewal. They've been division, confusion, and the scattering of the faithful. This is why Burke's words carry such weight. He's not just being dramatic. He's trying to prevent what he sees as a looming schism, not necessarily official or declared, but a practical one. A schism of belief, where Catholics no longer share the same understanding of sin, salvation, the sacraments, or even who Christ is. And here's what's even more unsettling. We might already be in that schism, we're just not admitting it yet. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a moment that demands courage. Courage from Pope Leo XIV to offer clarity where there's confusion. Courage from bishops and priests to speak truth even when it's unpopular. And courage from the laity, from ordinary Catholics, to stay rooted, stay alert, and stay faithful even when the leadership seems divided. Because in the end, this isn't just about Cardinal Burke or Pope Leo XIV. It's about Christ. It's about the truth he entrusted to the Church. And it's about whether we, as a global Church, are still willing to proclaim that truth without shame, without compromise, and without bending to the winds of the age. Let's bring this into focus. Throughout history, every time the Church has faced a crisis, whether doctrinal, moral, or institutional, God has raised up voices. Saints, reformers, prophets, people who were willing to suffer for truth, to be misunderstood, even to be silenced, all because they couldn't stay quiet while the faith was being distorted. Maybe Burke is one of those voices. Maybe he's not. Time will tell. But what's undeniable is that his warning has struck a nerve. And if the Church doesn't listen, if it continues down a path of doctrinal confusion, it may lose not just Burke, but a whole generation of Catholics who are tired of being told that clear answers are rigid, and that unchanging truth is somehow unpastoral. Because here's the reality. People are starving for truth. They're tired of relativism, tired of being told that every opinion is valid. tired of churches that sound more like TED Talks than temples of the living God. They want the real thing, and if they don't find it in the church, if the church becomes just another institution trying to stay relevant, then the church will lose its power, not because it stopped being big or beautiful or organized, but because it stopped being true. So what can you do? First, pray. Not as a cliché, but as a weapon. This is a spiritual battle, and prayer is your strongest defense. Second, study. Know your faith. Read the catechism. Understand church history. Don't just take headlines at face value. Know what the church actually teaches and why. Third, speak. Don't be afraid to raise questions, to challenge what doesn't sound right, to ask your pastors for clarity. Truth isn't fragile, it can handle your honesty. And finally, stay faithful. Even if the world goes mad, even if parts of the church lose their way, because the truth is still the truth, and Christ has not abandoned his church, even if some in it seem to be walking away from him. This moment we're living in, it's not the end, but it might be a beginning, the beginning of a purification, a pruning, a stripping away of anything that doesn't reflect the gospel. And if that's what it takes to wake up the church, then maybe this storm is exactly what we need. As the words of Scripture say, "For the time has come for judgment to begin with the household of God." Maybe that time is now. So keep your eyes open, keep your soul anchored, and don't let anyone, no matter how powerful, how charismatic, how authoritative, pull you away from the truth. Because in the end, that truth isn't an idea. It's a person, and his name is Jesus Christ.